modeling, some research, and then of course we want to tie this into our season recommendations for this year that you have in front of you. So jumping right into it, we always like to start with a little bit of history and talk about where we come from with elk. Of course, they were a native species, native to South Dakota, and they weren't not just abundant in the Black Hills, but they're also abundant across the plains as well. Like many of our ungulate species, unregulated harvest and market hunting had its impact on the population, and last elk was killed in the late 1800s. So elk were actually extirpated in South Dakota. They were brought back in the early 1900s through transplants from between state agencies. By 1950s, we had a limited population where we could actually start our first regulated season. We had low elk numbers all the way up through the 80s. And in the 80s and 90s, we made another effort to redistribute some elk and do some additional transplants to try and boost that herd in the Black Hills, and by golly, it seemed to work. In the 90s, the elk population really started to increase, and to the point where we were in the mid-2000s, we had too many elk and record elk numbers, and that's pretty well displayed here with our harvest data. You can see here, like I mentioned, very little harvest in the 80s, and the 90s it really started to ramp up. Of course, this coincides pretty well with our population. When we got to the point where we're in the mid-2000s, of course, we were starting to drought in the early 2000s. Elk numbers are increasing. We really ramped up our harvest on the elk to the point where this is our Black Hills cow elk harvest, includes CSP as well. We were harvesting close to 1,000 cow elk in 2005, so we ramped up on this population. And between harvest, and we had a growing predator population, we need to acknowledge too in the hills, lions were growing. Between harvest and lions, population really started to decrease to the point where we started to back off. So we were pretty low number there in 2013, all the way to the same point we were back in the 90s. That's how low our cow harvest got. So you can see here in 2014 we ramped it up a little bit, and our recommendation, of course, in 2015 will even increase that some more. Every hunter is required to check his elk in, and we collect the incisors off those elk, and we age that elk, so we have an idea of what the age of our harvested animals are. This is the age distribution of our Black Hills FIREARM bull elk. Just looking at that category, about 40-45% of those animals were considered what we would call a mature animal, 4+ years of age. Most of our animals that are 4+ years of age have about 6 points on each side, so it's a trophy animal to most of our folks that are hunting in the hills. And you can see the distribution of our other age classes there as well. And looking over time, this is just looking at our Black Hills units specifically over time here. The overall average is about 30%. If we were to average all these, when we talk about this upper mature age class in the red bars, our last 10-year average has been about 40%. It's been a little higher. You can, as we mentioned in the plan, we set a minimum threshold at 30%. We thought that was reasonable, and we'll see where we go in the future. But that kind of gives you an idea of all the way back to 1990s what the age distribution was on the bull elk that have been harvested in the Black Hills. So that's a little bit on our harvest survey data, and John's going to get a lot more into the details on some of our harvest data, but I want to talk briefly about our herd composition surveys. These are random ground counts that we do in August and September, and these are important because they give us our age ratios, which is an estimate of recruitment, and they also give us our sex ratios, which are important in our modeling of how many males and females we have in the population. And like I mentioned in the elk plan, we are evaluating our spring versus our fall herd composition surveys. But I'm going to go over some of our fall data right now. So this is our fall data dating back to 2003. We have our calves per 100 cows. So this is our age ratio, estimate of fall recruitment, and that's the brown bars here. So you can see this last year we were about 48, 49 calves per 100 cows. We've kind of been bouncing around that. This red line, that's our average, and it actually is right on 50 calves per 100 cows. So we see pretty good recruitment in the Black Hills. These dots here, those are just sample sizes. That corresponds with this side of the graph. And I just wanted to point that out. Since about 2009, we've had really good sample sizes in our fall class survey. So we feel pretty good about those data from 2009 on. Now looking at our sex ratios, same type of graph here. This last year we were at almost 24 bulls per 100 cows. Our average has been around 28. You know, it's a little hard to interpret these data because bull observability isn't the same as cows, so we think this is probably a low estimate, but we still need an estimate of what the sex ratio is in that herd when we look at population estimates and projections. So kind of gives you an idea of what we've been seeing. Of course, we've talked about the aerial surveys in 2013, and we're going to do those again in 2016. And our estimate for the Hills unit was 5,100. When we include Wind Cave and Custer State Park, it was 6,100 back in 2013. And that was on the Black Hills side. Now, we didn't know what was on the Wyoming side, but our plans are here in 2016 is we're trying to have a cooperative survey, and where Wyoming surveys their part of the hills and we survey ours. Right now, it's in the works. It's pending the Wyoming budget approval, whether or not they'll approve it to expend those funds to do the aerial survey. But right now, we're sure hoping that both sides can do an aerial survey at the same time. Give us a really good picture of all the elk in the Black Hills, since we share, obviously, a lot of those animals between Wyoming and South Dakota. Another thing we've been doing is survival monitoring. This past winter, actually into January, we hired a helicopter crew to come in and capture 50 cow elk for us. Kind of hard to see on this, but the bulk of them, these red dots, is where the captures were, and that, of course, that's the Jasper fire area. You can actually see that on the vegetation map where that fire was. You can't see them, but we had another 5 or so animals up here by Robay Lake, and so that's kind of the distribution of the animals we caught. But we're going to use those to monitor survival, and that's important for updating our models. But it's also going to allow us to evaluate the impact of increased cow harvests that we're anticipating to put on this herd as we try to ramp up our antlerless harvest. So where's the population doing? We look at all of our survey data. We look at our research data that's just completed in Custer State Park in Unit 2. And bottom line is we put that into our models. We have a growing population. Our lambda is greater than 1. So our elk population is growing. Our estimate for this winter, 2014-15, just looking at the Black Hills units, we're at about 6,100 animals. That's what the model's predicting right now. And that excludes Custer State Park and Wind Cave. So the population is growing, and that's what our models predict. So just real briefly, we've just wrapped up our elk research in Unit 2. Some great data. I'm hoping in the next month or so we can get either the grad student Ben Simpson or Dr. Jinks to come really talk about the details of that research, but I want to hit on a couple of the high points since it is pertinent to our recommendations. So over 2 years there in 12 and 13, they captured about 40 cow elk one year, 44 the next year. And we had an annual survival of 85%. That's good survival. That works well in our models. We also captured elk calves and looked at survival of those in the Unit 2 area. And you can see the numbers there, 37 one year and 34 calves captured another year. Most of those were being born around late May, early June. And our annual calf survival was 75%, which is really good. And that's an important part of our models, and an important part of why our models are saying the population is increasing, is because we're seeing that annual calf survival of 75%. Of course, Chad Lehman, who did the study in CSP, and I think he's going to talk to you guys next month, I hope. He's going to talk about the details of his study. We weren't that fortunate in CSP to see those types of survival rates in our calves, but I'll let him dive into those details more hopefully next month. A little bit about elk migration. This is kind of an important topic, and some of the things that were discussed and some of the comments we had on our elk plan. Ben Simpson, the grad student, did see several different migration strategies. On the left here, he calls these are migrators. There were some. This is just an example of one animal where he spent most of his winter range here and his summer range up here, or her, actually, it was a cow. And he actually had some that migrated up here in Deerfield, another group. So some migrated, shared part of Wyoming, some migrated to Deerfield. He had some that kind of went back and forth between their winter range and summer range, and he had some that pretty much just kept one range, and those were resident animals. So pretty interesting study. But the interesting part is the migrations to Wyoming. and I know we're going to have a lot more discussion on that, but he saw about 33% of the adult cow elk that he radio collared spent some portion of their time in Wyoming. So that's important. We are sharing elk with Wyoming. We always knew this, but the animals that he collared, that's what he saw. And they were spending about an average of 135 days in Wyoming. So some of those were obviously available for harvest during that summer-fall time. The fall departure dates, so when did they leave that summer-fall range and come into South Dakota basically to winter? 2012, saw it late November. 2013, it was late October. Perhaps some of that was driven by some of the weather events we saw. And then as far as calving, elk calving, about 15% of his calving sites, these are from cows that were collared in the South Dakota winter range, primarily the Jasper Fire area. About 15% of the calving sites were actually located in Wyoming. So some of those animals that were collared down here in Jasper Fire area, of course they're going all over, but some of them did end up actually across the border there in Wyoming and were calving over there. So some interesting data. Obviously that's just a piece of it, but with that I'm going to turn over to John to talk about our objectives and harvest and where we want to go in the future.
All right, we'll keep breezing right through this stuff, and I'll try to keep us on track here. So Andy pulled this up before when he was talking about the elk management plan. I just want to touch on this again. So the overall population objective, of course, is 7,000, but when we put that into perspective, an important part of that is these unit objectives. And so a couple things I'd just like to point out. When we say we want to go up to 7,000, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to do that, say here in Unit 2 where the bulk of our elk herd is. And I think there are a lot of concerns from some of the permittees out on the forest and some of those private landowners about that. And what I would offer to you is that when you look at this and oops, where did I go here? So the green is maintained, and of course the dark blue is substantially increased, and then red substantially decreased. So when we talk about increasing this herd, predominantly we're talking about this eastern front here, Unit 7, 5, 9, 4, in the northern part of Unit 3 here. So that's where the bulk of that increase will come from, and not necessarily, again, in that Unit 2 where all of the elk are here. And then we do have some private lands issues down here in Unit 3. You heard that mentioned, and we're not looking to make up that increase there either. So very important to put that into perspective and consider that when we look at that increase to the population and meeting that objective. Next, I'd just like to talk about the firearm elk harvest. This year we did have an overall success of 71%. That's great. That's awesome. And you can see with this chart here that we do have a lot of interest in these firearm elk licenses. That's no surprise to all of you, I'm sure. And we do continue to try and offer as much opportunity as we can there. But specifically, again, I'd point out this year and the last couple of years, so we've been up over that 70% success, minus 2013 there. And I think some of that drop in success was probably attributed to the snowstorm Atlas that we had. We did lose some hunting days there, and I think that definitely affected that success. So if we account for that, these last 3 years we've had quite good success. Next, we just wanted to throw this up. It's an interesting map here. So of the hunters that we surveyed and that filled out that survey online, they had that opportunity to put a point on the map where they harvested that elk. And so what you see here is 307 of the, there's a little over 500 elk that were harvested and hunters that harvested elk with Custer State Park, Black Hills Archery, and Black Hills Firearm. And so this is how it shakes out. It's kind of dark on this, but again, the bulk of that harvest is in Unit 2 here and then up into Unit 1, and then we do have some harvest down here in Unit 3. Just an interesting map. Taking a look at this information a little bit differently, this goes all the way back to 1966. A little bit of a busy graph here, but what you have with the lines with circles is success rate. The dark circles is harvest. The line with the black boxes is licenses. And then the triangles, the line with triangles is number of applications. And so what we like to point out here is just notice that increase in success into the 2000s here. We did dip a little bit as we increased those licenses like Andy talked about to reduce that herd in response to the drought and private property issues. But we did maintain pretty darn good success all through this period, up over 50% success. And of course that 70% success shows up here again. One thing that I do like to mention here is we are down, and of course the elk population did decrease a bit, but we're still offering more licenses that we did prior to the 1990s, and so we're still looking pretty good and offering quite a bit of opportunity there. With that, I just jump right into our rifle season recommendation. I wanted to make a few points here. You have this in your book, so you can see that overall we're looking at a slight increase to the any elk licenses, bring those from 420 to 430, and then a pretty significant increase in those antlerless licenses from 250 antlerless elk licenses to 500 antlerless elk licenses, and all of that increase is in Unit 2 here. So I'll take you back to that unit objectives map that we just took a look at, and you'll remember that we want to start to maintain elk in Unit 2 there. And so in order to do that, based on our models and projecting the population and look at our estimates, we do need to increase that antlerless harvest. And so an increase of 250 licenses there will, by our estimates, start to stabilize that population there. I'd point out just a couple other things quickly. Unit 4 and 9 here, we did have those both closed last year. We met with landowners in both of those units. In Unit 4, I was surprised. It was an overwhelming majority of those landowners there wanted to keep that season closed. We do have a wad of elk there, and in my opinion, we could open the season and start to allow some harvest. But quite frankly, that's 95% private land, and if those private landowners don't want to allow a season this year, then I don't want to put our hunters into that position. So we would recommend that we keep that closed. Now in Unit 9, it was a little bit different story. All of our landowners there, the predominance of those landowners asked that we open the season up. They were in agreement that that should be on a limited basis, but nonetheless they did want to open it up. Some of what's going through their minds is we did have a elk depredation complaint on a landowner. I can't hold that still enough, right down there by Hermosa. And so we are experiencing some damage in that unit. That does impact some of their decisions. But we would ask you to open that unit back up with 5 any elk licenses, just a really limited harvest and season there this year. From there, I'll jump to the archery harvest. I won't spend a lot of time here again, just point out these last few years we've just had really great success again. We're right around that 40% success with archery, and that's awesome when you look at archery success across the states that do have archery elk hunting opportunities. The only other thing I'd point out here is we do ask the hunters to rate their satisfaction of their hunt. 1 very dissatisfied, 7 very satisfied, and you can see we're hanging up there 5 plus and starting to near that 6, and so I'm pretty happy with those results. It tells us even with low licenses, the hunters are pretty excited about their opportunity there. Again, just looking at this a different way, so I'll focus in on this line with the circles, which is success rate, and then of course this line with the triangles, which is the number of applicants. So you could see that we've had a pretty dramatic increase from the mid-80s there up till now in the number of applicants, number 1, but along with that the success rate. Some of that can be attributed, of course, to the improvements in equipment and the availability of that equipment and people to pick it up and start that archery hunt, but interesting nonetheless. So I'll jump right into our archery season recommendation. So again, overall, pretty significant increases here. So we want to go from 92 any elk licenses to 144 any elk licenses, and 15 antlerless elk licenses to 56 antlerless elk licenses. So what I'll do is refer back to the plan here, and you'll remember what Andy talked about in that we want to issue, of the any elk licenses issued, we want to issue 75% to rifle and 25% to archery. And then of those antlerless licenses, we want to issue 90% to rifle and 10% to archery. So if you look at these numbers, and I'll just focus in on the numbers at the bottom, 144 any elk licenses is 25% of the total any elk licenses that are being offered, and likewise 56 is 10% of those antlerless elk, those total antlerless elk licenses being offered. One other quick point here, you'll notice in this case we didn't ask for archery licenses in Unit 9 there. While we want to maintain that 75 25% breakup of rifle and archery licenses, there's not always going to be opportunity in every unit for an archery hunt. And talking to those landowners there again, they didn't feel that they wanted to field archery hunters, at least at this point. And so what we did is just took those 2 that we would have offered in Unit 9 and added those in here to Unit 2 to make 85. Moving right along, just quickly brush over prairie elk harvest here. Not much to say other than we do run pretty good success, considering that these are predominantly private land units. 95% of the land in these prairie units is private, and these elk can be transient. So sometimes they may be in the unit during the season, and there's other times they're not available. But nonetheless, we're still running pretty good success with that prairie elk season. The recommendations before you today are to adjust the number of licenses from 57 any elk. We want to reduce those to 48 any elk licenses, and 36 antlerless licenses, increase those to 50 antlerless elk licenses. We do want to close the season essentially in Unit 30 over in Gregory County there. The last couple of years we haven't harvested any elk. There really haven't been any elk available to the hunters there, and so we feel it's appropriate, at least at this time, to not issue any licenses there. We do want to add a portion to the Bennett County season, and I'll go over that on a map here just a second. And then we'd like to change the season dates for the Bennett County 11C season as well. One thing I want to mention is that in all of these units, again, they're predominantly private land, and so it's important for us to work with those private landowners to set these seasons and adjust these seasons. So a lot of the changes you see are a direct result of talking with those landowners and asking them how many hunters they think they can field, where they'd like to see elk harvested, and when they want to harvest those elk. So in this case, what we had is the landowners come to us and ask us to shut down that any elk season at the end of November versus the end of December. And what they want to do there is get those bull elk hunters, if you will, in and out so that they can spend December focusing in on that antlerless harvest and try to knock back some of those cows because of the elk causing damage on their private property. Taking a closer look at that unit boundary change. So what we're asking you to do is add this portion of Jackson County up here. This is the current elk unit, and then down here you could see we've added this portion. It's south of Highway 44 there in Jackson County, and then south of BIA Road 2 there in Jackson County. And again, the reason we're asking for this is we do have a couple of landowners roughly in that spot right there that did experience damage the last couple of years, and what we'd like to do is have the ability to bring in regular season hunters to help try and address some of that damage and have that opportunity. We took it all the way across here just because rather than when these elk move to a new landowner coming and asking you to keep changing that unit boundary, we felt that would be the simplest way to address all of them in one shot and not have to keep coming back and change that. So the Custer State Park elk recommendation, we're asking that you keep the antlerless season closed as well as the late archery season. And again, looking back to the plan, so we would like to issue 70% rifle tags there and 30% archery tags. And so really the big change that you're looking at this year is we'd like to keep that early archery elk at 4, and then we'd like to raise those any elk rifle licenses to 8, which would make that 70-30 split. And the fact of the matter is, while we want to build that herd and we're looking to substantially increase, we do still feel that there's some opportunity to harvest some additional bulls, and so we can do that with those rifle seasons. And it's likely that our success rate, you could see in both of these, they're 100%. It's likely that we'll stay at 100% next year, and you could expect a harvest of 12 bulls next year if we make that increase to licenses. All right, I'll wrap this up here. Every year we try to give you some idea of what impacts these changes might have to the population. And so Andy mentioned earlier, of course, our the best estimate we have, kind of that anchor point, if you will, is that estimate from the helicopter survey the winter of 2013, which was 5,100 elk, and that does exclude Wind Cave and Custer State Park. And so if we look at the model projection for the winter of 2015, so right now, if you will, we're estimating approximately 6,100 elk. And again, that excludes the parks. So if we were to not make any changes here today and just keep things the same and roll with the same season as we had in 2014, we'd be looking at an increase to the population in a winter of 2016 estimate, so about a year from now, of approximately 6,700 elk. So that'd start to bring us pretty close to that objective of 7,000, and not really slow growth, if you will. So with the recommended changes that I've presented here to you today, we'd be looking at a winter estimate in 2016 of about 6,500 elk. And of course, that slows the growth of the population, and that's all going to be in Unit 2, of course, because that's where we're adding those additional antlerless licenses to bring the bulk. Really, that's where the bulk of the elk are, bring that population and start to maintain it. And with that, I think I did pretty good. I was a lot quicker than Andy. I'll take any questions.
Questions for John? You kind of wowed you guys, huh? Go ahead, Scott.
I have one. We have 8 rifle and 4 archery. Is there then a 13th one, the raffle tag? Is there a raffle tag?
The 8 that you see, so one of those would be the raffle tag. Yep, and then the other 7 would be regular draw.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Or we have proposal. Do you guys want to try to get through proposal, Tony, or would you just want to do it